hello everyone. Welcome to another conversation today. In this series, we focus on a specific topic of prominent relevance as it relates to the 1031 exchange and DST investment landscape. Today, we're going to be digging into the concept of liquidation and exit strategy, specifically from a DST investor standpoint. This topic was brought up in conversations that we have with investors and found that it would be an interesting topic to highlight today. So I'm really excited to be joined by one of our vice presidents, Eugene Ma. Eugene, welcome to the conversation and thanks for being with us.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Happy to be here and very excited to participate in this episode.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we kind of unpack this, Eugene and I were conversing before. I think what would be really helpful is to provide some context as to how a DST goes full cycle. What we mean by that, what the typical investor experience looks like there. We're going to dig into both a traditional exit or sale, and we're also going to dig into a 721 exit and sale. There are some specific differences as it relates to the investor experience. So before we even get into that, I think it's important to know that a DST investment is set up as a medium to longer term investment that is purpose-built for a passive 1031 exchange investor. So these investments are typically stabilized, newer Class A properties that are created and built to achieve consistency in distribution, preserve the investor's original principal, and hopefully create some modest equity appreciation on exit. So these properties can be anything from, say, a Class A multifamily property in Dallas, Texas, to an Amazon distribution facility, to a multi-tenant industrial property in Charlotte, larger institutional caliber real estate deals that are created with an end in mind. So we call this the projected holding period. And it's a common question that we receive is, how long do I have to commit to this investment for? When can I expect my money back? And what does that look like? So historically speaking, I would say 95+% of DSTs that have gone start to finish have done so in what we describe as a traditional sense, right? The property is acquired, structured by the sponsor as a DST, managed by that sponsor for 5 to 10 years, and then put on the market and sold, right, to an unrelated third party. In the sale, that is when the liquidity event is achieved for all of the investors simultaneously, right? So maybe let's start, Eugene, if we can kind of dig in more on the investor experience. What have investors historically, what have they experienced historically, and what can maybe a newer investor that's looking at a traditional DST, what does their experience look like leading up to the sale?
Yeah, Matt, this is actually a pretty timely topic. For whatever reason, we've been getting quite a bit of inquiry lately. Matter of fact, I just had a call this morning about this. I would say first and foremost, just like any other investment, there is at least a determined event to go through the exit. For a lot of investors, it's important to equally evaluate what the potential exit strategy would look like as you're going through, looking at your options. So I'd say the first and foremost, the most important piece is communication. I think an investor, at least a potential investor, when they're looking at this type of investment, they can expect some type of communication piece from the sponsor company. So they typically give the investor an advance notice regarding a projected or predetermined sale. So at that point, I think through the communication, there is a piece of paperwork, what we call election form. So election form is a very simple, usually a 1-pager or typically 2-pager, that the investor will have to declare or at least make a decision on how to, or at least, in terms of exit options, how to evaluate and also what their final destination will look like. So from an expectation standpoint, right, there's the communication piece, and then there comes a little bit of homework that will require potentially some guidance with your K Properties rep. But truly, I think the investor would need to evaluate what their circumstances are at that point as they are considering some of the options on the table through that form.
Yeah, well said. So just to touch on both of those in a little bit more detail. So in terms of the communication, sponsor companies will typically communicate months in advance to the investors that are in that particular DST that they are evaluating the market and evaluating the possibility of a sale, right? So the investors are at least put on notice that, hey, we're looking at this, right, as an option. The next step from there is the sponsor would, if they felt the DST was within a certain value range that made it appropriate to formally list the property and formally proceed with trying to sell the asset, they would notify the investors in that next step, right? Hey, we got brokers' opinions of value between X and Y. It would achieve, X to Y result from an investor return perspective. We're going to go ahead and start interviewing brokers, look to put the property on the market. They would then, the next step, communicate, okay, we've chosen Colliers, or we've chosen Marcus & Millichap to represent us. Property's on the market. We've received 80 offers. 10 of them look legitimate. We're going to a best and final stage. And then, okay, we've narrowed it down to these 3 offers. We've evaluated each of them. Okay, we're going to choose this offer for X, Y, and Z reason. We're officially under contract. The property is scheduled to close in 45 days if it passes the 15-day due diligence period, right? So the investors are notified every step along the way so they can start to prepare and evaluate, to your second point, their situation and be able to make an election that makes sense for their current circumstance. So once the property is typically under contract and there's a specific closing date in mind, the sponsor is going to task all the investors to return that election notice, right? That one piece of paper. And the election notice is very simple. How do you want your portion of the proceeds to be handled? Do you want them sent to your bank account, or do you want them sent to a qualified intermediary? And the qualified intermediary, of course, allows the investor to complete another 1031 exchange. If they're sent to the investor's bank account, they would receive the funds in liquid cash, but that they would incur a tax liability as a result of that. So, Eugene, can you maybe drill down a little bit more into the cash out option and the 1031 exchange options, kind of go through some of the advantages and disadvantages that are associated with each and what maybe investors should be thinking about if they're leading up to a full cycle event on their DST?
Yeah, absolutely, Matt. I think this is probably the part that a lot of investors are potentially the most excited about because they've kind of gone through the journey and now they are at the mountaintop, right? They're a fork road with some options available. So what are those options? What do they look like? And how should they prepare for these options? I'd say the first and foremost, I think that the most common option would be to cash out or tax out, right? There are many ways to say that, but truly the expectation there is the investor want to take back the lump sum of the proceeds from the sale for a variety of reasons. The advantage, I think, with taking a lump sum, of course, is you have immediate access to that capital. You can, redeploy that elsewhere. It's typically a little bit more mobile. It's the investor's decision to decide how to redeploy that. It could be a variety of reasons. It could be personal, maybe investment related, sometimes family, maybe medical emergency, stuff like that. With the cash out option, the disadvantage there, of course, is the tax burden that comes with it. Anytime you don't reinvest the proceeds from the exchange, you're typically looking at, potential the capital gains that you've been deferring. It's going to become due. Of course, follows with depreciation, recapture, and all the fun stuff. So that is, I think, for that option, when you look at it, truly it's the cost that the investor will have to incur down the line. But at least the immediate joy or the excitement is, hey, I came to a position of this lump sum. How am I going to deploy that? It's truly at your own discretion, at the investor's discretion. You have full control of that process. Now, to some investors at that point, I think at that juncture, that's very exciting for them.
Mm-hmm. And just to jump in here, I would say the cash out option we see a lot less commonly exercised than the 1031 option in terms of having the funds sent to the qualified intermediary. So the cash out option is for an investor, at least in our experience, typically who has achieved a step up in basis, right, over the course of ownership. So maybe a lot of that tax liability is no longer there as the DST interest has passed generationally through a death in the family, or if there is some type of emergency, or there is benefit, right, to having cash in your hand now, and it might be worth paying a little bit in tax to have access to liquidity for an array of different reasons. Certainly it's an option, and it's a great option to have at your disposal to be able to reevaluate the investor situation. I would say the majority of the time, most investors want to continue deferring the taxes, right? They started this whole tax deferral train. They want to continue in the tax deferral train. And that is making sure that those funds are sent to a qualified intermediary, which would start the 45-day clock, would start the 180-day clock, and all of the 1031 exchange requirements would come back into the fold. Can you touch on, Eugene, maybe the two different approaches that investors can consider, even in the context of a 1031 exchange, if they elect to have their funds go to a qualified intermediary?
Yeah, of course. So for those investors who are interested in continuing their tax deferral journey, within the framework of a 1031 exchange, there are two types of 1031 exchanges that are available to them. The first one is what we deem direct purchase. So the funds are with the QI. The investor, for a variety of reasons, would elect to purchase their own assets once again. Now, I would say potentially the main motivation behind that type of decision might be, a trophy asset becoming available, or the investor is really, really in love with the process of just being a landlord. That can happen, right? Mm-hmm. So everybody's a little different. So with that type of situation, with that type of election, I would say the advantage, of course, is the investor will be able to retain ownership and management responsibilities. To some people, that's very important. Of course, your tax deferral journey continues. The disadvantages, of course, are all the headaches and all the triple T's that our firm talks about, the tenant, toilet, and trash, that will come back into the equation, into the picture. So for investors who have the aptitude, the energy to deal with all of those, go ahead, right? The direct purchase through a 1031 exchange by buying your own property, again, is back into the mix.
Right.
The second position would be for investors with the funds with the QI, for the investor to truly consider a rollover. So meaning selecting another DST to continue the tax deferral journey. The main draw here, of course, truly passive, not a lot of work involved for the investor. And I would say for the investors who truly realize the time value or rather the opportunity cost of time. I'm drawing back to our undergrad Econ 101 over here. An hour spent doing property management is an hour taken away from you to be able to enjoy the benefits or potentially income or even experience of something else. So this is a very personal, I think, question is how, for the investor, they have to decide what is truly, worthy to them, because time, you and I know, it's a finite resource. You and I get 24 hours a day. We get to spend it however way we choose to. So for some investors, that's doing property management from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. For others, they rather prefer to have something a little bit passive like a DST to be able to deliver the same type of real estate exposure investment experience while also receiving the benefits with minimal work involved.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just to shed a little bit more light, our experience historically has been the majority of investors coming out of a traditional DST are going to elect the 1031 exchange and are going to reinvest those proceeds into another DST. I think we stress, the three options because the traditional DST approach provides investors the unique ability to reevaluate their situation and course correct if needed.
Sure.
But for the majority of our investors, the whole reason why they got into the DSTs in the first place was to defer the tax and to be completely passive, right? And to enjoy the benefits of a mailbox money type position in these different real estate investments. And historically, investors have been pleased, for the most part with their experience and elect to continue to reinvest into another DST or several DSTs, for replacement. To shift gears a little bit and talk about like a different exit strategy, which has become a little more prominent lately, is the 721 exchange, right? We've talked a lot about this. Investors, I'm sure, have read a lot of the literature we've put out. The 721 exchange is another exit out of a DST, but instead of that DST being sold to an unrelated third party, it is sold to a REIT or a larger fund. And that larger REIT or fund is always controlled by the same sponsor company, or majority of the time it's controlled by the same sponsor company that's managing the DST. So we get the question in lieu of full cycle experience of, okay, what does it look like if I'm involved in a DST that is oriented towards a 721 exchange? So Eugene, maybe if you could start kind of walking our listeners through what is the experience like for investors that have had their DST interests acquired by a REIT and have been subject to a 721, whether it's a kind of a required 721 or an optional 721. Can you dig into that a little bit?
Yeah, Matt, I think it's important to remind investors not every DST program that they're looking at or even participated in comes with a 721 option or exit strategy. So it's important to note that. Now, for the ones that do have that avenue available, the typical experience, going back to the theme of communication, truly it allows the sponsor or the 721 manager to directly, infer or share with the investor that a valuation it's available. So typically, if there is a 721, trigger to be pulled by the 721 manager or the REIT manager, DSC investors will be notified, of course, of the valuation. And the valuation is based on current market dynamics, sub-market demand. Ultimately, the purchaser or the acquirer of the DSC is the REIT itself. So it's important for our listeners to note the manager of the REIT and the manager of the DSC typically are in the same family or the same brand. So it's very unlikely to be able to go from DSTA into REIT. Like external party REIT. Mm-hmm. So all those things have to coincide together. I would say, I think within, when it comes to REIT, there are two subcategories, right? The first one is what we call a mandatory conversion. So within a conversion or exit strategy, investors who are invested in DSTs, they don't get to elect or don't have the selection option to decide whether they are joining the REIT or not, because they have predetermined, they've participated in a program that's predetermined to enter into a REIT program. So it's simply just a communication piece by the manager, by the REIT manager to the investor at a predetermined value. So what happens to your DST ownership is this is simply conversion into what we call OP units of a REIT. Maybe another way to think about it, to break it down in layman terms for our investors, OP units, it's equivalent to ownership of a REIT or REIT shares. Mm-hmm. And then the second option when it comes to the REIT on the exit part is what we call a optional exit. So investor will have the opportunity to evaluate the market with your K Properties representatives to see whether it makes sense based on how their life has changed, how their circumstances around maybe their family members has also evolved, to decide if entering into the REIT program is meaningful for them. So, our house view is that optional 721 typically provide the greatest segue, because it leaves the door open for the investor to evaluate and justify their actions down the line. It's very hard to maybe make a decision today for an event that'll take place typically 5-10 years down the line. So right. Again, the theme here is we want to keep the door open for the investor to evaluate their options.
Yeah, I think that was really well said, and I like the way you kind of broke that down. I think one of the aspects of all of this that is really important is the setup, right? So in a traditional DST, you have a traditional sale process, right? You're going out to the market, you're finding a buyer, and you're taking the highest quality, highest price offer that you can get. In a 721, where a DST is being contributed to a related entity, which is a REIT also controlled by the same sponsor entity, the same sponsor company, it's different in the sense of the transition is based off of a specific valuation, right? Rather than a valuation that's assigned by that sponsor company versus a valuation that's achieved in the greater marketplace. And I think that distinction is really important to know. Now, the DST sponsor as the trustee and fiduciary to the DST owners, and that same sponsor as having a fiduciary responsibility to the shareholders in the REIT, has to create fairness and value on both sides of the equation, right? So there's a very formal appraisal process that they have set up to do their best to achieve fairness of value to both sides of the equation. But ultimately, that transition point is marked by a specific valuation that's provided based on what the market's able to provide. So I really wanted to stress that distinction. And then in terms of time frame and investor expectation, that time frame is communicated to the investors, just like a traditional sale. The valuation is also communicated to the investors. And if it's a forced 721, meaning all the investors are going that way and they've invested in a DST they knew what they were getting into, it's very simple. Here's the valuation. We went through our appraisal process. This is the equivalent value of OP units you're being assigned based on this specific valuation. And this is the date you're going to be transitioned into the REIT, right? You're going to trade ownership interest in the DST for the operating partnership units. And it happens, right? And it's, from an investor standpoint, it's relatively uninvolved, right? It just the transition is made and it happens and their ownership is reclassified. In the context of an optional 721, the same process is typically taken with respect to value, but there's a specific difference. The specific difference is the REIT, which once again is a related entity to the DST, or it's managed by the same sponsor company. They are giving the investors the option to 721 into the REIT, or the option to accept cash in exchange for their ownership interest in the DST, right? So the REIT's agreeing to pay a specific dollar amount, and they can pay you in operating partnership units, or they can pay you in cash. The operating partnership units, the 721, there's advantages and disadvantages there. With the cash out, that gives the investor the same opportunities that they have in a traditional sale, right? They can take their proceeds in cash, incur a tax liability. They can send the proceeds, the cash proceeds, to a qualified intermediary and purchase another DST or another hands-on piece of property. So to further your point and agree with your point, Eugene, I think our stance as a firm is more options are always better than fewer options, right? And in an optional 721 exchange, the investor will have time to evaluate both the REIT that they could potentially join through the 721. They can evaluate the DST marketplace that they can 1031 exchange into. They can evaluate local opportunities if they want to potentially go back into direct ownership, and they can get with their CPA and calculate their total tax liability and see what other after-tax investment opportunities exist. So with the optional 721, there's really 4 different options that the investor has in front of them. Typically, the traditional 721 events happen in a similar time frame as a traditional DST, and that, call it 5 to 10 year window, where the forced or mandatory UPREIT happen typically in that 2 to 4 year time frame, so a little bit shorter. And there's distinct advantages and disadvantages to each. We're not going to get into all those because just of certain time constraints. But is there anything, Eugene, maybe you want to add, or anything else you want to kind of stress as we kind of transition to closing the conversation today?
Yeah, Matt, I think maybe the takeaway here for investors really is their options are there in front of you for selection, and things change all the time. As we know, the world's changing day by day. So it's more important to really keep the door open when it comes to options. It's better to have the option and not need to exercise against that than needing an option but having a narrow path and don't have the opportunity to execute. So, these are applicable to every areas of our lives. I think optionality is certainly a premium that investors tend to overlook when it comes to investing in any arena. So I would say continue to evaluate these things with your K team. And of course, things do change, and that's why we're here for all of you.
Absolutely. I think that was really well said. More options is better than fewer options, generally speaking. And I think another thing is I would just encourage all the listeners to just continue to educate yourself, right? There's a lot of nuance to investing in general, specifically to the DSTs and exit strategy. So if there's anything that we talked about at a high level today that you would want to dig into more, I would encourage our listeners, please reach out to us. Reach out to your K Properties representative. Go to our website. We have a ton of great educational resources there for you. And our hope in putting these out is that these conversations are informative and helpful. So Eugene, thank you for your time once again and all the insight you provided. And to all of our listeners, we appreciate you taking the time. Hope you all have a great rest of the day, and we look forward to speaking with each and every one of you very soon. Thanks, everyone, and take care.
Visit us at www.1031.com for instant free access to exclusive investor resources, including our DST 1031 Exchange Book and the first ever 721 UPREIT book, written by our CEO and founder, Dwight K. You'll also find our Delaware Statutory Trust catalog and investor case studies. The K Properties team has helped over 4,000 investors nationwide, and we're here to help guide you every step of the way. If you'd like to connect with us directly, give us a call at 855-899-4597.